Indian Act. Historically, control over First Nations was a British responsibility that passed to Canada after Confederation. As the fur trade ended, First Nations peoples were increasingly seen as a barrier to government plans for the settlement of Western Canada. The government called it the Indian Problem. The government responded to this problem by creating the Indian Act in 1876. The Indian Act is a legal document and a set of laws that gave the government complete control over the lives of Indigenous, Indian peoples. The Indian Act is a Canadian federal law first passed in 1876 that governs matters concerning First Nations, including Indian status, bans, and the administration of reserve land. Historically, it has been criticized as a paternalistic and assimilative tool that gave the government control over many aspects of First Nations lives, such as identity, family lineage, leadership, education, and cultural practices. The Indian Act has been amended numerous times, but remains a source of controversy and has had significant negative impacts on Indigenous cultures and communities. Control over Indigenous peoples. The Indian Act regulates and administers the lives of registered Indians and reserve communities. It imposed imperial political control and enforces restrictions on Indigenous peoples' movement, their right to live where they please, and their right to practice their culture and traditions. Assimilation. I would like to read a quote. The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. Sir John A. Macdonald, 1887. The Gradual Civilization Act passed in 1857 and sought to assimilate each Indian into Canadian settler society through enfranchisement. Historically, if a First Nations individual wanted to vote or attend post-secondary school, they would have to renounce their status. The purpose of assimilation was to absorb First Nations people into Canadian society. The Indian Act built upon this notion of assimilation, forcing First Nations to give up their culture, rights, and languages. This act also introduced the elective band council system, which emulates colonial democracy. This system still exists in First Nations governance today. A famous statement in 1920 by Duncan Campbell Scott, poet, essayist, and Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, stated the prevailing attitude of his day. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott. 1894 Compulsory Schooling. The Indian Act was established to force attendance of Indian children and youth into school, initially known as industrial schools, which ran from 1883 to 1923. After 1923, these schools became known as residential schools. Part of the federal government assimilation policy focused on eliminating First Nations children's cultural beliefs and practices. First Nations parents were fined or jailed if they did not send their children to residential schools. 1905 forced removal and relocations. The Indian Act was amended to include that First Nations people can be forcefully removed from reserves near towns with more than 8,000 residents. 1920 Residential schools. Amended to make it mandatory for parents to send their children to Indian residential school. Further amended to allow for the involuntary enfranchisement and loss of treaty rights of any status Indian considered fit by the Department of Indian Affairs, without the possession of land previously required for those living off reserve. This amendment was repealed 2 years later, but reintroduced in a modified form in 1933. More than 150,000 children attended Indian residential schools. Many children experienced physical, mental, sexual, and emotional abuse. Children experienced insufficient nutrition. And tragically, thousands of children attending residential schools never made it back home. Documented deaths include at least 4,200 deaths, which are officially recorded by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, but this number continues to grow. Identified children. To date, only about 2,800 of those children have been identified by name. Unmarked graves. The ongoing use of ground-penetrating radar has uncovered thousands of potential unmarked graves at former school sites, confirming that many children were buried on school grounds without their families being notified.